How's it? Aloha kako. This is Father Charles Browning, the priest here at St. Mary's Episcopal Church in the beautiful city of Honolulu, Hawaii. And tonight, we're going to do something that I'm actually surprised I've not thought of doing sooner. And that is have a little conversation about our history as St. Mary's. A little background behind this decision was that as I was working on doing our history stuff last week, sorry, getting some wires out of the way here, as looking at our Anglican history last week, and I ended last week by saying, oh, we'll do a part 2. And I thought about doing just sort of picking up where we left off, because we ended last week where we talked about the history of Anglican Christianity in Hawaii. We left with annexation. And so I thought maybe we'd talk about the Episcopal Church's history in Hawaii at that point. And I realized there was, let me just say, I think that for us here at St. Mary's and our viewership, the history of St. Mary's is more interesting. That's not to say that the history of the Episcopal Church at large is not. But I feel like most of us here might be a little more interested in hearing some stuff about our history, and that this video could serve as a sort of primer, however you want to pronounce it, on our history for the benefit of folks who may come across our website and our church in their journeys across the Pacific, as is an occasional occurrence. And plus, you know, once the 1927 history book that I have get started, or the 27 history book that I shared with you all, and I'll share. I guess I don't need to share that again. If you need it, what the heck, I'll put it in there. I'll link in a minute. I'll just have to do that now while I'm thinking about it. This book gives us a little bit about the early days of the Episcopal Church in Hawaii, but it's largely presented as, this parish was founded to do yada, 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 yada. So that's what got me thinking about the founding of St. Mary's. And of course, I thought about that. We are coming up very soon to our 120th anniversary as a church, because we were, as you'll hear, we were founded in 1902. The exact date of that, there is a bit of I feel like I've seen somewhere where it says that our first Eucharist ever held as part of the St. Mary's mission was on December 13th. I've also seen December 6th. But we currently have December 13th on the calendar. But that's roughly around the time that we get started. And I've talked a little bit with Vestry and a few folks about how we're going to observe that 120th year. Perhaps we should be doing more about it. I don't know. It's hard. It was hard to think about what to do with the pandemic looming. And when I look at our history in St. Mary's, we celebrated our 75th, we celebrated our 100th. So maybe it makes sense to celebrate our 125th. So we have some time to look forward to planning for that. So, but we'll be looking at this year a couple of key occasions. We'll be celebrating our 120th year, because the actual celebration itself comes at the end of the year in December. So anyway, but because of that fact, because we are entering into our 120th year of ministry, I thought this would be an appropriate time for us, and a good time for us to take a look at our history. So that's what we're going to do. If this is your first time tuning in with us, again, hi. We always do a little bit of evening prayer as part of our gathering. So I'm going to share, in case you need it, if you have a prayer book at your disposal, a 1979 Book of Common Prayer, according to use of the Episcopal Church of the United States of America. Well, I shouldn't say United States of America, because the Episcopal Church is itself a worldwide church. You know what I mean? But if you have that prayer book, we will be on page 139. If you don't have access to that prayer book, then you can click right over to that link that I just popped into the chat box and scroll down to where it says in the early evening, and you can join us from there. Um, while we're getting adjusted to that, I usually also do a little bit of housekeeping and stuff. So I just gave some explaining about why we're doing what we're doing tonight. I'm also going to let you know about what's going to happen next week, because I'm kind of excited about next week. So next week's topic is introducing the Common English Bible translation. And you may be saying, well, Father Charles Browning, why are we talking about the Common English Bible translation? Because I want us to use it. I met with the worship committee this past Sunday, and we talked about this. So we find ourselves in the Episcopal Church at an interesting moment. So just a brief version of how I've shared this with the worship committee. We have 18. I think the exact number right now is 18 approved English translations of the Bible for use in the Episcopal Church. And I think 11 of those are English translations. So 18 translations, I think 11 of them are English translations. These, but weirdly, the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible has sort of become our de facto official, almost exclusive translation. For reasons I don't fully understand, church publishing only uses the New Revised Standard Version for its lectionary books, for its gospel books, and so on. Daily office books, all of that. So if you buy a resource that has scripture in it from church publishing, it's going to be New Revised Standard Version. Even though we have other versions that are approved out there, that's what you got. The thing about the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible is that as it currently stands, it is not like, it exists in the sense that you own, like I do, a New Revised Standard Version Bible, you have it. But it is not, it's, I'm not sure, I think how to put this. It's been updated. I'll just put it that way. They call it the New Revised Standard UE, the NRSV UE for updated edition. So they have updated the New Revised Standard Version, which is funny because the Revised Standard Version is its own revision. The New Revised is a revision, and now we have an update. So we have an update to a revision of a revision. So that's where we are. The NRSV UE is currently the only form of that if you go to like Bible Gateway and look up the NRSV, that's the only version you can find. So we're getting to a place now where the NRSV, as we've known it, is fading out, and so a new translation is coming. So you may be saying, well, fine, why don't we just use the updated edition? Partly because, like what I just said, it's an update of a revision, which I'm not sure that I'm a huge fan of that process. The other thing I'm not a huge fan of is that I'm not sure that I fully support the type of revision that was done. I have no problem. Let me say this, that what the updated edition is seeking to do is it's seeking to make things more, like language more inclusive and expansive and things like that, similar to the kind of work we're doing with the prayer book. And I don't necessarily have a problem with that. I do have a problem with how that work goes about. And I'm not entirely convinced that from what I've read of the NRSV UE, that the work was done without a particular ideological bias in mind. Which brings me to the Common English Bible. The Common English Bible was completed in 2011, and I'm a fan. And I've been using it since it first arrived in 2011. And it does the same things that the NRSV UE aims to do, but rather than being a revision of a revision of a revision, it is a wholesale new translation of the Bible, probably one of the most ecumenical translations of the Bible ever conceived. Again, I don't want to take away from the class next week, but I just wanted to mention that starting in Advent, we are going to be using the Common English Bible in church. Bishop Fitzpatrick, by the way, is a fan of the Common English Bible. So there's that too. And it's the translation that I've been using in these classes. So if you think it's weird or whatever, or you don't even notice, there you go. So we're going to give it a try. That was the worship committee's conclusion. Let's give it a try for the seasons of Advent and Christmas, and then we can check in on it around Epiphany time. So we will be starting that in Advent. So to prepare us for that, I'm going to do some introductory work of the translation, what went behind it, some examples of passages, maybe a couple of places where I think it's weak, some places where I think it's strong, and then also to highlight some of the weird, unique stuff that it does, and like weird in a good way, I think. So that's next week. We'll be talking about the Common English Bible and introducing it for us all. So you can look forward to that. So with that now, let's move into our time of prayer for this evening. So let us just take a moment let's get our prayer books and our websites and everything settled, and then just take a moment of stillness. Take a moment of stillness to let the concerns and cares about the rest of our days and weeks to just fade away, and to just sit in the presence of the Lord, to feel his love, to feel his presence, his spirit with us. And I now invite us to say together, O gracious light, pure brightness of the ever-living Father in heaven, O Jesus Christ, holy and blessed, now as we come to the setting of the sun, our eyes behold the vesper light. We sing your praises, O God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. You are worthy at all times to be praised by happy voices, O Son of God, O Giver of life, and to be glorified through all the worlds. Our reading for this evening comes from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 4, beginning at verse 28. Don't you know? Haven't you heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He doesn't grow weary or tired. His understanding is beyond human reach, giving power to the tired and reviving the exhausted. Youths will become tired and weary. Young men will certainly stumble. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will fly up on wings like eagles. They will run and not be tired. They will walk and not be weary. Here ends the reading. So that reading, if you follow this enough, you know that the readings are picked in accordance with what we're talking about. They're reflective of our topic. That reading was picked because our senior warden, Bill Mock, used it in one of his previous tenures of senior warden when at an annual meeting of St. Mary's in 2001, they were talking about the recently arrived rector, Father Hathaway, and it's recorded in St. Mary's history book. And so, reading through the history book once again, and I saw this, I thought this is a good verse for us at St. Mary's, because it, just as an aside, it was also like the last verse, by the way, of the passage, the Eagles one. It was also the verse of my school growing up. But it's a verse it's a passage of scripture that I think reflects and speaks to our life together in St. Mary's and in the history of St. Mary's, because especially this thing about God not growing tired or weary, even though humans get tired or weary, but the Lord can also undo that weariness and that tiredness. And, he gives us the strength to go on. And that's St. Mary's history. St. Mary's is a church that has gone through a lot of change and transformation. It does not have a straight line in its history. It's been many things, and I'll talk more about that. But I think it's as we're entering into our 120th year, we think about that as we're beginning in April to install your new rector. This is another thing that's good to remember, especially now that we're coming out of a very tiring and wearying time in our history together. The pandemic has put a lot on us, and it has been a tough time. And we are emerging from that and entering into a new day and a new dawn. As I said online, we're looking at our first 120 years. So we trust that the Lord will continue to renew us as we've been renewed multiple times in our past. And we look forward to what work the Lord has in store for us in the bright future that He has for us as this parish and in this place where we find ourselves. Amen. And I invite us to just take a moment of silence or stillness, I should say, once again, to think about how the Lord gives us strength, maybe even to think about those places where we personally right now are tired and weary and need the Lord to give us strength. We also now can offer our own prayers and thanksgivings to God, either silently or aloud. And I now invite us to pray the prayer that our Lord Jesus taught us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. Lord Jesus, stay with us, for evening is at hand and the day is past. Be our companion in the way, kindle our hearts and awaken hope, that we may know you as you are revealed in Scripture and the breaking of bread. Grant this for the sake of your love. Amen. Right, as we transition out here, grab a sip of tea. You verify that everything's good on the connection. Okay, good. All right, so I've shared a little bit in our introductory time about our topic, and I've talked a bit about why we chose it and all of that. I have to admit something, and that is when I made this adjustment for us to talk about St. Mary's, I may have bitten off a little bit more than I can chew. And the reason for that is we've got the 1927 Handbook on Missions that I shared with you online. I printed it out. And so we've got, you can even see my notes that I made on the text in a section that talks about St. Mary's. It's pretty cool. It's a good summary of our history, at least the very early days of our history. But in addition to that, we have my predecessor here, Father Greg Johnson, had put together a little brief short biography of all the previous clergy of St. Mary's. So there's information, and that's not it's not thick, but it's not thin either document. So we've got that at our disposal. There is also, of course, Father Greg's 2019 annual report, rector's report, annual meeting report, which is what he calls a timeline. But it's not an insignificant little historical document here. So there's that I've looked through, and then of course there is our very celebrated 100 years St. Mary's Episcopal Church, 1902 to 2002, done by Uncle Shure Hirazawa with Jane Oki and Bernice Towarahara doing editing and research work. But this is a very beloved document, which if you've not read it, is available on St. Mary's website. And I am going to link to St. Mary's website in case you are watching and are curious about this. Because if you scroll down, you'll see that this is on there in a 4-part section. So this all together is a not I already used the word insignificant. I'm going to say it again, a not insignificant body of history to go through and to figure out how in an effective way, in simple way, to present that. So like I said, I've bit off a little more than I can chew. Well, to summarize all of that within, the 30 to 45 minutes that we effectively have together, is again a not insignificant thing, right? It's a tough task. So what I've realized in looking through this paperwork, we're going to focus primarily on the first 50 years, the first third of our history in St. Mary's. We'll touch on the other parts here, but I think we're really going to focus on that. And the reasoning for that is that history. Our earliest history is the history that we're probably, many of us here at St. Mary's are less clear on. Some of us know a lot about it. Some of us have probably forgotten a bit. Some of us, but that's the area where there's some, we can really focus and talk about things. That's not to say the other history is not important. It's just that that's a history that I think many of us know, especially the last 50 years or so, have been the history that is our history. We know it. And I know this because as I flip through the later parts of that history book, I see all y'all's photos and I start recognizing names that people know. So so that we get really quickly, into the history that we really do know because many of us lived it or were very close to it when it took place. And I know that there are folks who are tuning in online that are not from St. Mary's that might like to learn about that stuff. And that's cool. I just give you a resource to where you can do that. But again, we'll touch on some of that stuff. But I also want to focus on this early part because this early part of our history coincides with the early days of the Episcopal Church being in Hawaii. And it also, that first 50 years or so is a very different story than what happens later. Because in that first 50 years of our history, we're doing something very, very radically different from what happens really after the end of the Second World War. And when we transition into a bit more of a conventional parish identity. So I want us to focus on our unconventional bits of our history. And I'll get to the other stuff too. But before I get into any of that, I just wanted to take a moment to pull back the picture and just talk about what I understand St. Mary's and see St. Mary's as from reading a bunch of this history today. And that is, well, not just today. To make you think that I just did like all it is today. I'm not that fast of a reader. I wish I were. But is when I look at this history and revisit this history, because I read through much of it in my early days here. I read through Uncle Shurei's book when I was in the discernment process to be here at St. Mary's. So I've looked at this stuff a fair bit. But it's now being in the church for almost 3 years, and to have taken on ownership of the church, to look at this history again from this perspective as I prepare to be installed as rector, I see things differently and I recognize things a little bit differently. But I also start to see where my role in this church's history is starting to take shape. And to think about what my role is as the priest here in carrying us into the next steps of our history. For the brief time that I will be with you. And I don't mean that to say that like I'm planning on getting out anytime soon. I just mean that I think St. Mary's has a long history to it. And in the grand scheme of things, the time that any of us have in this church is just a drop in the story that God wants to tell through us. Talking about clergy leaving, though, that's one of the things too that also is sort of fascinating in the latter history is just, and even though we find it all throughout the history of St. Mary's, that clergy come and go all over the place in this church's story. And not like because people come and they get mad and they leave, and that we have that in our history for sure. But we see a lot of folks who wind up leaving their clergy role in this church because of circumstances completely outside of their control. Like, oh, they come to be a priest here, and then the bishop decides, now you're going to work at the cathedral now, or I'm going to send you to a neighbor island, or something's happened, you have to go back, you're going back to the mainland, or whatever. So that's a sort of a fascinating thing. But the other thing that's consistent with St. Mary's history is that we are a church that's always moving and changing and evolving. The first 50 years of our history is a lot of movement. One consistent thing throughout our history is that we build things, we demolish them, we build new things, we relocate them from other places. Our clergy leadership is sometimes long-term, sometimes super short-term, sometimes part-time, sometimes full-time, sometimes no time. One strong through line throughout this church's history, though, is the laity. And that this is a church full of very committed lay folks who feel very called to the ministry in this place. And that ministry itself is also constantly changing and updating with the times. St. Mary's history is flexible and nimble. And that is a really powerful thing because a lot of churches aren't. So St. Mary's should be celebrated for that fact. And I would love to sort of meditate on why that is. But again, we'll get into the history a little bit more here in just a moment. But I just wanted to take this sort of pull back vision of St. Mary's and give a bit of a sort of my own forward type thoughts about our history, reviewing it here once again. And to really highlight and share that I'm very humbled and moved to be a part of a church that has such a cool history and a different history. Just before I get into it, I'll just contrast it with churches I've either worked for or have been exposed to in the past, right? A lot of churches, for example, my previous parish, I was at the Chapel of St. Andrew in Boca Raton, Florida, also served as the school chaplain at St. Andrew's School in Boca Raton, which today was their celebration of St. Andrew, the Feast of St. Andrew for them. Which I just saw online. But the Chapel of St. Andrew was founded out of St. Andrew's School. St. Andrew's School was planted in Boca Raton, Florida, back in reclaimed swampland, so that initially boys could be at a boarding school out in the middle of nowhere where they couldn't get into any trouble. They still found ways to get into trouble, but that was sort of the idea, was put them out in the middle of nowhere. But then the suburbs caught up with that area, and the Diocese of Southeast Florida wanted to plant churches in that area. And instead, they made a choice, rather than buying property and try to start a church anew, use the chapel on the school grounds as the basis to plant a church. So there was a church congregation worshiping in the school chapel. And that's how the Chapel of St. Andrew congregation got started. And they had 3 rectors, and I'm the third. I was the third. So that's a super recent, easy to tell history that was well cataloged, but very linear. School, church plant, rector, now search process again, right? It's just very straightforward story. Similarly, I was at Holy Trinity Episcopal Church in West Palm Beach, the first church I ever worked at as an associate right out of seminary. And that's a church that has like a over 100-year history. But its history is that the land that church was built on was land that was sort of, I don't know, gifted or developed or whatever by Henry Flagler as he was building his railroad down south. And they realized that as Palm Beach was being set up as a sort of winter playground for the super wealthy of the United States, they needed people to work all those resorts and hotels and all of that. So he built a town west of Palm Beach that is called West Palm Beach, where the middle-class workers for Palm Beach could have a place to live and worship and all that. And so there was land that was designated for churches to be planted. And so Holy Trinity was planted in one of those properties. And so it had a pretty linear church history. It was always understood that it was going to be a parish church and it would grow out of that. Contrast this with St. Mary's, which has an incredibly different history. Again, it is not a linear history. So we're going to get into it. What happens? Where does St. Mary's begin? Well, St. Mary's begins in 1902, as we've already mentioned. That year is consequential for Anglican Christianity in Hawaii because that is also the same year that officially the former Reformed Catholic Church of Hawaii becomes the missionary district of Hawaii of the Episcopal Church. Bishop Nichols of California had come over representing the presiding bishop. He was named the bishop elect, or the bishop in charge of the missionary district. Side note, very interesting that when the Church of England came, they did not make this a missionary district or a mission district. They immediately made it its own autonomous province. But when the Episcopal Church took it over, we turned it into a mission district. Kind of interesting to me that that's what they did, but it is what it is. During annexation, as we mentioned last week, Bishop Willis was the last Anglican bishop, and he stayed as bishop here until basically the Episcopal Church decided to change something. The General Convention voted to recognize the former Church of Hawaii as a missionary district. Bishop Nichols was sent over to kind of get things in order for the permanent bishop, which would be Bishop Restorick. So in 1902, Bishop Restorick comes in. And while he is here, serving his first duties in the this new district of the Episcopal Church, a woman by the name of Madge Maroney approaches him. She apparently, out of the goodness of her heart, she's a teacher from Mo'ili'ili Public School. She has been leading a Sunday school on the weekends. She is starting to get up there in years. Her health is starting to fail. And so she asks the bishop if he has any interest in wanting to continue this Sunday school work, and if there are resources and whatnot to do it. This is a fortunate encounter because Bishop Restorick came into a province of the Episcopal Church pretty much unlike anything that the continental United States dioceses have. This was multilingual, multi-ethnic, right? It was not white. It was not a strictly white bread diocese. Here we were as a former state church, and had a prominent Hawaiian speaking and Hawaiian congregation in the cathedral. And of course, it comes in at a time when there had been a lot of Chinese families that had moved into the islands for work purposes, as well as Japanese families. I have to brush myself up on the history of the Chinese families, but I know that the Japanese families were brought here at the invitation of King Kalakaua when he went to Japan and met with the Emperor Meiji, and they shared a relationship to have Japanese workers come and work in the plantations and stuff, and sugarcane fields and things here in Hawaii. I know that Chinese families came for that purpose too, but I don't remember or recall if it was an official invitation or if it was just folks looking for work, and came in the same kind of rush of folks that Chinese families that went then to California and other places to build railroads. That's neither here nor there. The point is that Madge Maroney had her Sunday school was full of Chinese kids, and the bishop had learned that there was that St. Peter's, which had been planted out of the cathedral to be a church for Chinese. We're seeing folks, coming from Evanside as well as from like our area in Mo'ili'ili in town to worship. And so St. Clement's Church had decided that they wanted to do some kind of outreach and ministry to Chinese families within their parish boundaries. And so they went to St. Peter's, because obviously they're the experts in the game at this point. And St. Peter's is happy to do this work, and the bishop is happy to continue this work, and the bishop sees an opportunity. So he brings over the Reverend Kong Yin Tet, who is the rector of St. Peter's, brings him over with some other folks, and encourages them to rent a store in Mo'ili'ili to continue the Sunday school work. Madge Maroney has one request in all of this, and that is that the mission be named after her beloved late sister, who was named, of course, Mary. So that's how we get the name St. Mary, which I've joked with this congregation before, and I think I shared a writing once, that because we're technically named after Madge Maroney's sister Mary, should it, like, we assume that we're St. Mary, the mother of Jesus, God bear Theotokos, but we could be any Mary. And so in a way we can be inclusive of all the Marys as we need or feel fit to be. You know, some days we're the Blessed Virgin Mary, some days we're Mary Magdalene, some days we're Mary Tudor, Bloody Mary of England. Let's be honest. So that's how we get the first name, St. Mary's Chinese Mission. And so we start in an old store in Mo'ili'ili, and it grows really rapidly. And so around this time too, at the start of it, I wasn't clear from some of the history, but it seems that that Charlotte Teggart and Hilda von Deerlin, who both teach at St. Andrew's Priory, and I believe both were formed in the Deaconess's School, St. Faith's in New York. They come to also help out with this growing ministry and work for predominantly Chinese children. And then a couple years after that, there is Mrs. F.L. Folsom. According to the 27 history book, she is said to be the matron of Iolani, but Uncle Shure says that she is the matron of St. Andrew's Priory. And we're going to go with Uncle Shure on this one because, I mean, you don't go against Uncle. But the other is, the 27 history is a lot more general. It's from a person who's outside of this community. We're talking, somebody wrote a history from within. So I think he knows what he's talking about. I think, Jane and Auntie Jane and Auntie Bernice also knew what they were talking about. So when they did the research to help him. So anyway, so this is, Folsom comes, Miss Folsom comes, and she's very important to the work. So she comes from the school, from the Priory. Eventually, by I think it's 1906, she decides to fully dedicate herself to the work of the ministry and mission of forming and educating children. She moves out into a shack in the Japanese camp. She also manages to acquire for rent a big house on Buttatunya Street for the work. And so the big house, all the different rooms serve different purposes. One of the things that is a dispensary. I'll talk about that in a moment. But there are classrooms, residential quarters for the women that are doing the work. And one room is also established as a small chapel. The altar of that chapel, I understand, is the same altar that resides in our current chapel. And so that's been with us. If I am incorrect in that, please tell me. But from what I can gather in the histories that I've read, it's the same altar. So they have the Buttatunya house, and this is where they begin a lot more of their work. They start a day school for girls and a night school. The night school is notable because it results in one of our first prominent converts, a guy by the name of Timothy Len Shin Liu, who I'm sure St. Mary's folks have memories of him, or Kapuna remember, mostly because he's a very faithful member. His family gets very involved, and especially his two daughters which are Auntie Bernice and Auntie Amy Chong. And of course, their families are very involved still, and relatives are still involved with St. Mary's to this day. So multiple generations. So we have families going all the way back to these early days. So the Bertania House is is not a palace by any means. This 1927 mission handbook notes the mission was housed in a miserable shack with a leaky roof. And with its growth, larger, better quarters were necessary. I take it back. I messed that up. Okay, so the Britannia House came later. This was the house that Miss Folsom rented that was next to, that was near her house that she lived in the Japanese camp. And apparently it was very poorly made. And then they rented the Britannia House, which is not a leaky thing. It was very nice. I apologize. I don't want to mischaracterize our history here. And so they rented this property. And so it turned out, and that was when things got really big. Again, the dispensary was an important piece because, so the dispensary was established to help out for mild medical needs, right? So something that like you don't have to go all the way to Queen's Hospital for. You have an injury nearby working in, pineapple or sugarcane or whatever was being grown here at the time. You just need some scrapes and stuff fixed up. They had a dispensary for that. They also taught hygiene to people. I think Miss Folsom spoke Chinese, and so he was able to converse with them in Chinese about various hygiene things. So hygiene education is a big deal. But I bring up the dispensary because obviously in our current day, the word dispensary tends to mean something very different. It tends to refer to a store that sells a particular herbal product that is becoming increasingly legalized in the United States. A little Pacalolo, if you know what I mean. So I have joked with a few folks here at St. Mary's, and I can only imagine if the bishop ever sees this, what he's going to think. But I've joked that maybe we should consider renting a nearby retail property and opening our own, resurrecting the St. Mary's dispensary. Maybe we can make some good capital for ministry purposes. I'm only partly joking. But anyway, so we had a medical dispensary that was a big part of our ministry here, so much to the extent that it became sort of the headquarters of like a nurse's station for the Mo'ili area. The other thing about the day school that was started was what was brilliant about it, and this was when the day school was started at the Britannia House is when also a lot of Japanese children started to attend the school, especially girls. And the reason for this is that a lot of the families at the time did not trust putting their girls in public schools, but they wanted their girls to have some education. The genius move that they had, that like Hilda Van Dierlen and Folsom had, was to offer a good, hot, fresh meal for lunch for every student. And so these were families who were scraping by. Many of them were very poor. And so the idea that their children could at least get a meal while getting an education was felt that was a good idea. And so people were flooding into this school to the point that in these early days, and this is again like 1911, they had to cap enrollment at 150. So already the St. Mary's mission has a lot of kids involved. And it's starting to outgrow this space that they currently have. So 1910, they're starting to run out of space. Then they find out that like in 1911, 1912 or whatever, that the owner of the house is wanting to sell the property and put it up for, or wants to sell the property. So their lease with it is running out. So now the mission has to find its new property. So they locate a good chunk of property on what is, on King Street, where they purchase it, and it gives them the opportunity to have a permanent home rather than having to move. So they've moved from a store to a shack to a decent house, and now property that there's room to grow. And once that property is purchased, the frontage is established as the address as 2062 South King Street, or I guess this time just King Street, which is our current address today. So we arrive on our property 1912-ish. So a house is built on the property that has many rooms in it. So that's called the Mission House. One of the rooms serves as a chapel. But a few years later, they know that they want to build a chapel, and so they designate space to build a chapel. Now, This is where a name comes up, which is Margaret Davis. Margaret Davis is the wife of a Brigadier General Davis. Brigadier General Davis, who became a general, I understand it, as a courtesy by a superior officer. He was promoted as general like right before he retired, so that it would help him with his pension, because generals get more money. But he used that extra money from that extra money he got to basically pay for St. Mary's first freestanding chapel. But what I can gather is, especially from Uncle's book, is that he is a very humble man. He does not want a whole lot of attention lavished on him. Bishop Restorick is like, well, you basically get naming rights for this thing. And he says that he wants it to be called the Margaret Davis Memorial Chapel. And so Bishop Restorick gives a proclamation that this new chapel will be henceforth named the Margaret Davis Memorial Chapel, which is still standing. It is the historic chapel here at St. Mary's. It is it has been expanded since then, which we'll talk about in a bit. But that's it. That's the building that still stands on our property. It has since also been known as the Soldiers' Chapel. And so, but that is the historic church building on our property. It's a beautiful building. It's a building that we sadly don't use enough. But if you ever want to come and see it, best chance to do that is Saturday nights at 6 p.m. We have evening prayer in there. And then we usually do Christmas Day services in there and a couple other things throughout the year. Some funerals and stuff too. So, but it's a beautiful historic building that I know is very much loved here at St. Mary's, a building that I love too. But we'll talk about this, get into that a little bit more. But that chapel was completed in 1917. There was the new house and everything also at that time, or the new house was, let me get my dates right here. The new house was 1912 when it was dedicated. And it was dedicated by Bishop Restorick, but Bishop Willis, the last Anglican bishop, was a guest of honor at that dedication, which I think is very sweet. But then in 1917, the chapel was completed. The first Eucharist was held in there, but it was not properly dedicated by the bishop until 1919. But so that's the property that we currently reside on. And so from there, we continue this growing work of educating and children and bringing health to the community and forming people for faith. And then around this time, Miss Folsom winds up going to Hilo to do work. And so there's new leadership. Hilda Van Deerlen takes a particular role in this work in leading the congregation. I haven't said much about the clergy. That's because the clergy that are doing stuff in the chapel aren't generally full-time clergy here. They are they're working part-time, or they're like full-time working at like St. Elizabeth's or St. Peter's or St. Mark's, and they're coming over. Epiphany too. They're coming, St. Clement's. Sorry, just thinking all those places. They're coming over and pulling double duty with the mission because the mission is seen as its own thing. But Hilda Van Deerlen has a dream, and her dream is that she would love to expand the work of the mission toward poor, destitute children, homeless children, orphan children. And that dream comes to fruition when 3 girls come to live on the property. And this is after Bishop Restorick retires, and we get Bishop Lamotte, who, when he comes in, by the way, he comes in like 21. He has just a laser focused passion on St. Mary's. And whatever they want to do, he's like totally on board. He helps secure funds to expand the property, because when he comes in and there's the orphans that are living on the property, they're sticking them everywhere because it's become such a valuable thing to the community. So there are children sleeping on the lanai. There's children sleeping in converted classrooms. There's children sleeping in like living rooms and all kinds of stuff. So they realize they need a proper orphanage. So Bishop Lamotte works really hard to secure the extra property or to expand the property. And so they build a double building orphanage, a boys wing and a girls wing. One is named for Bishop Restorick's wife. Can't remember the name of the other one off the top of my head right now. But this is where the orphanage is established. And of course, it's a hugely successful orphanage for the next like 25 years, or actually probably 30 plus years, I think. It becomes a place where celebrities from the 20s, like silent film stars and early talkie stars, when they come to vacation in Waikiki, they make appearances at the St. Mary's Orphanage to visit the children and, of course, get their photos taken for the papers and stuff. But it becomes a place where celebrities are hanging out. Again, Bishop Lamotte loves the place. Lamotte is on his days off, is actually coming over here and like mowing the lawn and doing other like things around here. Hilda Van Dierland in one of her writings says this is what he does to unwind. But he is just very committed to the ministry of St. Mary's, and we experience just immense growth. So the orphanage does well, and the orphanage is primarily for Chinese and Japanese children, but it grows to include Filipino, Korean, just all kinds of local Hawaiians, all kinds of people. So that is our focus. Is this orphanage and the chapel for their that serves in their religious instruction and all of that. And this sort of continues as our thing until the 1940s. Because Bishop Kennedy becomes our bishop, and he becomes a bishop around the time, during wartime. Interesting, I will just comment, is Father Frank Chun today just randomly sent me an email from the guy who writes the historical stuff in the Star Advertiser. And his new thing that came out today includes a line from a kid who was one of our orphans. I can't remember his name right now. I'll see if I can find it and pass it along. It's not a very long thing, but it just mentioned that he was an orphan that lived at St. Mary's, and that he ran over to see the damage caused by an artillery shell that fell during the Pearl Harbor attack on a nearby house. So, so that's very close to home. But after the war, or the idea of orphanages begins to fade out sort of everywhere, not just in Hawaii, but everywhere, with a preference toward fostering. So it takes a couple of generations, it takes a couple of years, but by 1958, we decide that the orphanage closes and the building itself has become termite ridden and just bad. And so it is decided to be demolished. But between like the 1940s and the late 50s is when we go through quite a variety of priests once again. People who come to sort of be there, but then like they're sort of splitting their time between St. Mary's and St. Mark's. St. Mark's gets them full time. Others wind up going to Colorado after a brief tenure because of some unforeseen circumstance. But one supply priest that plays a really big role for us, and I got to get this guy's name right because I always want to call him something that he's not. Not like a bad thing, but let me find him real quick. Oh, that is Father Paul Savanac. I always want to call him Savarak. That's why I wanted to look. Savanac. He was an administrative assistant in the bishop's office, a priest, and he played a very crucial role in our church during this time. It was under his time with us that the decision was made to tear down, not raise up, but raise the orphanage buildings. And once those were demolished, the current chapel, the Margaret Davis Memorial Chapel, the chancel was expanded not too long after the new stained glass windows were put in. But that chapel was actually physically relocated from its spot, which was where the current worship space, the contemporary worship space, currently resides. It was moved over there onto the spot where the orphanage used to stand. And then the old chapel property was flattened to make way for the building of a new parish hall, which of course in the 80s would become our contemporary worship space. At this point, this is where our history begins to shift, because we move now away from, this mission work of evangelizing and working with children as like the primary focus, and get into the more conventional parish ministry thing. And this makes sense because this is the post-war period, the post-war boom, where the Episcopal Church sees its highest numbers. Just as an aside, when we talk about the decline of the membership of the Episcopal Church, we always talk about that decline in relation to our peak in the like 50s and 60s. That is actually just that's an aberrant spike when you look at our entire history, or look at the Episcopal Church's entire history. Because remember, a good chunk of that history, we were not Episcopalian. But and so anyway, during this time, churches are booming. People coming back from the war are settling into new neighborhoods, new communities, and they start joining churches, all of that. And so St. Mary's is, just like everyone else, is a recipient of that boom of church participation and attendance. And so this is why we start morphing into a more conventional parish growth model, because that's what everyone's doing at that time. Like I said, the Episcopal Church is doing great in terms of its numbers. And so this is the direction that we wind up going to. And then, that leads into a fairly quick history that we kind of know a little bit about, right? We have a parish hall. We're growing. We're focusing our attention on community outreach. We're offering like evening programs. We're doing like community dances, making it sort of a community center. The parish hall is serving that purpose. But really quickly, we start to realize, starting in the 70s, we start to realize that our space needs are for worship are outgrowing the memorial chapel. And so the work begins in the early 80s, the late 70s to the early 80s, to renovate the parish hall into a contemporary worship space. And of course, that happens during the time of Father, not Duncan, the guy after him. See, a lot of names floating around in my head right now. One of you is probably yelling at the screen right now what the guy's name is. And I just read it not too long ago. Father McGlynn. Woo, there we go. Father McGlynn during that was priest during that transformation. And then we went from a pretty interesting succession of having a rector and then going through a couple years without one and then getting one, and a couple more years without one and then getting one, up until, the quick succession of Father Hathaway and then Father Johnson, and now this guy. One of the big events, of course, that happens in the midst of all of that is also the building of the education building that our preschool resides in. So we built it for the purpose of starting our own preschool. Father Lipka seems to not agree that having a preschool was a good idea. Then we got a preschool back, but then we rented it out to Angels at Play, and so that carries on St. Mary's heritage of educating children. Even though we are not doing it directly, it's a little more indirect these days, but that is also a continuous through line of our history. I know that's very quick, and there's a lot more to be told, and there's a lot more that you can read on your own time. But that's why I wanted to have this out there for us, because it helps us as we're moving into the next steps of our ministry to know our history. I was listening to an archive of one of my Olelo classes, Hawaiian language class. And the Kumuku was sharing that the Hawaiian perception of past and future is the inverse of the Western perception of past and future. In the Western model, we think of the future as being ahead of us. We look to the future, but and the past therefore is behind us. But in the Hawaiian model, the past is actually in front of us. Well, that's the thing we can see. The future is behind us. It's unknowable. And so, and that, in order for us to get to the future, we have to look to the past. And there's some brilliance to that. I was thinking about that theologically, right? That we know our future by looking to the book of Revelation and to the prophecies that are found in our 2,000-year-old plus scriptures. So we look to the past in order to know our future. And that's the same thing with us here at St. Mary's. It's important for us to look to our past. Because we are now in a new moment of evolution and change. We have come through a challenging time, and it puts us, like with many churches in this diocese, to start thinking new and thinking about what we're going to do next, and what how we carry our vocation as a parish into this new world. And we're extremely well equipped to do that because it's what we've always done. We cared for Chinese children, and then Japanese families showed up, and we cared for them. And then other groups came in, and we cared for them. And then orphans showed up, and so we became an orphanage. And then when orphanage fell out of favor, we stopped being an orphanage, and we became a parish during a boom in the church. We grew into that. And when we realized we still wanted to educate children, we built an education building for that purpose. And then when we got really big, we needed a new worship space. We built that. We tore things down and built things up. It's what we do. It's what we do. And so when we embrace that role, that history, and that identity, that's where that's where our wisdom and our future is. And so that's why I'm excited about the next 120 years of St. Mary's and beyond. Because we are a nimble and flexible place, and the Lord has called us to be nimble and flexible, and we will continue to be so. I just personally am excited to be the rector of this church during these first steps of this new history, because it's an honor and a joy and a place of being humbled to shepherd you all, to shepherd a 120-year-old church into its, because it's not just us, right? We are our history, we are ancestors, we are all those things. Our kapuna are part of us. Our ancestors are a part of us. So I thank you for that opportunity. And I hope this was interesting, informative. And if you want more, if you want me to talk about more history of St. Mary's, let me know, and I will find a time to continue this conversation, because there's so much that is not said. There's so many names not mentioned. So it's tough to do it justice in the short amount of time that we've had. And, like I've said, and I'm looking at the time, I'm 1 minute past, even though I started 5 minutes late. So I guess we're not over time. But that's our history. That's our history. And it's a good history, and it's an exciting history. And I hope you'll have fun looking at these resources that I've brought your attention to if you've not looked at them before. One thing before we leave, I do want to comment. So the 1927 Missions Handbook has some cool old photos of St. Mary's, at least one that I've not seen in Uncle's book. But there's a great line in it toward the end, because again, we're talking 1927. So Bishop Lamotte is bishop. And he's almost one of the closing things of this 1927 handbook is something from him. So I'm gonna read it. Some work among Japanese, let's see, a lack of both men and means prevailed any real advance. Probably the most serious situation thus created was the inability to meet adequately the needs of the Japanese. To minister to this group, the church had only 3 definitely Japanese stations: Holy Trinity, Honolulu, Holy Apostles in Hilo, and a small work in Pa'auilo. Some work among Japanese was done in connection with other races at St. Mary's and St. Mark's. It was a difficult and discouraging situation. And this is Bishop Lamotte's quote. Ever since I have been here, he wrote in 1925, it has been borne in upon me that the greatest difficulty in presenting the gospel of Jesus Christ to I apologize, it's an antiquated term, but again, 1927 book, he uses the term Orientals. Presenting the gospel of Jesus Christ to the Orientals is the careless attitude of such a large number of white people. Good for Bishop Lamotte in 1925 to call the white man out. Next to this must be counted the inadequate number of men and means available for the church's work. So yet, once again, the church in Hawaii is, that's a history that carries through the entire diocese's history, is the need for people and money. But that's another good thing to be reminded to hear that as, from a white bishop to a white man, 100 some years apart, almost 100 years apart. To think about the diverse ministry that we have here, and that the success of that kind of ministry is in some ways dependent on rejecting apathy, and to be a aware of what needs to be done, which is the kind of work we're doing in this diocese as a diocese. And so at St. Mary's is one too. So anyway, there we go. That's our history. Some of it, just a part of it, a fraction of it. So do some more exploring tonight, and have or throughout the rest of the week, and have a good week. And please join us on Sundays for worship in person or via this here YouTube channel. And this week we are celebrating the Feast of the Holy Sovereigns, King Kamehameha IV and Queen Emma. And so that's a cool thing to get into some more local history and celebrate some local saints and some important saints. So have a good rest of the week. Have a good night. And I pray God's blessing on us all in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. All right. Malama pono. And hui ho. See ya.